The night Vera Langston put on the blue dress, she told herself it didn't matter what anyone thought. She was wrong. It was the kind of December night that made Manhattan feel like a movie set. Snow falling in slow diagonals outside the Plaza Hotel, the windows glowing amber, the sound of a string quartet drifting through the lobby like warm breath. Everything was beautiful. Everything was lit for people who belonged here. Vera did not feel like she belonged here. She stood near the far end of the grand ballroom, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, wearing the only formal dress she owned, a deep navy blue gown she'd bought 3 years ago for a company event and pressed carefully the night before on her kitchen ironing board. Her dark hair was pinned up. Her earrings were cubic zirconia that her mother had given her for her 25th birthday, not diamonds, but close enough that no one would know in the low light. She had gotten ready alone in the bathroom of a midtown hotel room she'd paid for herself. Preston had said it was better that way. Less complicated, he'd said. She hadn't pushed. She never pushed. That was the thing about Vera Langston. She had spent 2 years making herself smaller, quieter, easier, so that a man who was ashamed of her could feel comfortable in his own skin. She watched the room from the edge of it. Watched the women in gowns that cost more than her monthly rent. Watched the men in tuxedos who shook hands and laughed with the practiced ease of people who had never once doubted their right to take up space. Watched the servers moving between them with silver trays and invisible spines. And she recognized something in their posture that she recognized in herself. The careful stillness of someone who has learned not to be seen. Preston was somewhere across the room. She'd watched him arrive 20 minutes earlier with his father's team. He'd glanced at her once, a quick, cold scan that said, "Don't come over yet," and then turned back to the cluster of investors around him. Vera set her champagne down on the nearest surface. She smoothed the front of her navy dress, and she told herself, just 1 more hour. You can do 1 more hour. She had no idea that in 40 minutes, her entire life was going to split open like a fault line, and that what came out from underneath it would be the last thing she ever expected. Vera grew up in Pittsburgh, 3rd floor of a narrow house on Terrace Street, daughter of a high school art teacher and a plumber who worked doubles every winter so the heating stayed on. She wasn't from nothing, but she wasn't from much. What she had was a brain that wouldn't quit and a hands-on instinct for space. How a room felt when you walked in, how light changed mood, how the wrong chair in the wrong corner could make a person feel unwelcome without knowing why. By 22, she had a degree in interior architecture from Carnegie Mellon. By 26, she had her own freelance practice in New York. Small but growing, built entirely on word of mouth from clients who kept calling her back. She met Preston Alcott at a client walkthrough in Tribeca. He was there checking on a renovation his firm had funded. She was there measuring a wall. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for 4 minutes before saying anything. Then he asked for her card. Then he asked for coffee. Then, slowly over 6 months, he asked for more. Preston was charming in the way that well-raised men from wealthy families are often charming, polished, attentive, funny in a way that felt like a gift. He remembered small details. He asked good questions. He made Vera feel for the first time in a long time, genuinely seen. She fell for him hard. But 2 years in, she had never met his family, had never attended a single event on his arm, had never been photographed beside him or mentioned in any context that would confirm to anyone in his world that she existed. When she brought it up, he had smooth answers. Not the right time. It's complicated. My father is old-fashioned. Let me handle it. She believed him because she wanted to. because the alternative was to admit that she was someone's secret. Tonight, Preston had finally invited her to the Alcott Group's 40th anniversary gala, the biggest event the family threw all year. Vera had thought it meant something. She'd spent a week telling herself this was the turning point. She got dressed alone, arrived alone, and now stood alone at the edge of a ballroom full of 600 people who didn't know she existed. She should have recognized the shape of it. Instead, she smoothed her dress one more time and waited. Preston found her at 7:45. He was everything she'd fallen for and everything that had quietly been breaking her, packaged into one man in a perfectly fitted black tux. He touched her elbow lightly, the way you touch furniture you want to move without making noise. "You look good," he said. "Not great, not beautiful. Good." "Thank you," Vera said. "I've been here almost an hour." "I know. I was in meetings." He handed her a glass of wine she hadn't asked for and turned slightly, steering her toward a cluster of people without fully including her in the approach. "Come on, I'll introduce you to a few people." Vera followed. A group of 4, 2 men, 2 women, all in their 40s, all expensive, turned as Preston approached. Smiles expanded, hands extended. "Preston, wonderful evening," said the older of the 2 men. "Thank you. I want you to meet Vera Langston." Preston placed a hand briefly at her back, light as a formality. "She handled the interior redesign on our Midtown offices this year. Brilliant work." The group smiled at Vera with the polite warmth people reserve for service professionals they're briefly acknowledging. "Nice to meet you," one of the women said, and turned back to Preston. Vera stood there. She waited for a correction. For Preston to say, "Actually, she's more than that." For the word girlfriend to surface from his throat. It didn't come. He talked. He laughed. He moved the conversation forward, and Vera stood at the edge of his circle in her navy blue dress, introduced and immediately filed away, as a contractor who'd done some nice work on an office building, the same way someone might mention a good painter or a capable electrician. She was not his girlfriend. She was not his partner. She was not anyone's anything. She was the designer. After 4 minutes, a server passed with a tray, and Preston smoothly took 2 glasses, handed one to the woman beside him. Not Vera. The woman beside him. Vera stepped back, then back again, until the circle no longer had an edge where she fit. She stood alone with her untouched wine and thought, 2 years. 2 years. She turned toward the nearest hallway, needing air, needing a wall to lean against, needing 45 seconds of privacy before the thing rising in her chest became something she couldn't hide. She got as far as the corridor. That was where she saw Sabrina. Sabrina Wolf was standing beside the bar at the entrance of the East Corridor, laughing. She was wearing a red dress that Vera recognized, a Valentino that Sabrina had shown her on her phone 6 weeks ago, asking if it was too much. Vera had said it was perfect. She'd meant it. Sabrina looked stunning. And she was looking up at Preston Alcott like he was the funniest, most fascinating man in any room he'd ever walked into. Preston's hand was at the small of Sabrina's back, not the brief, transactional touch he'd given Vera. Something settled. Something familiar. Something that had clearly been there long before tonight. Vera's vision went white at the edges. She pressed herself against the wall of the corridor, breathing in shallow pulls. Her champagne flute was still in her hand. She didn't remember picking it up. She watched for 30 seconds. That was all it took. It wasn't the body language of people who'd just met. It wasn't even the language of people who'd been introduced at events. It was the specific, private ease of 2 people who had shared a bed, who knew each other's silences, who didn't need to perform for each other anymore. Sabrina laughed again and touched Preston's lapel. He did not step back. Vera and Sabrina had been friends since their junior year at Carnegie Mellon. 12 years. 12 years of phone calls and bad breakups, and shared apartments and holding each other up through things that had no names. Vera had been Sabrina's emergency contact when she had an emergency. She was listed as such on Sabrina's phone. Still, she'd seen it last month. Last month, Sabrina had asked about Preston. How are things going? Is it getting serious? Vera had said yes. She told her they were close to something real. Sabrina had said, "That's so wonderful. I'm so happy for you." The marble floor of the plaza felt like it was tilting. Vera turned and walked. Not quickly. Quickly drew eyes, and she didn't want eyes. She moved at the pace of someone going to get another drink, someone heading to check their phone, someone who was absolutely fine. Down the corridor, past a mirrored alcove, through a side door marked restrooms. Inside the women's bathroom, all pale marble and orchids in crystal vases. She found the last stall, locked the door, sat down on the closed lid, and pressed her hands flat against her knees. She did not cry. She was past the part where crying came easily. She just breathed. And in the silence of that bathroom stall, Vera Langston made a quiet, precise decision. She was leaving. Right now. Tonight. For good. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She pushed open the stall door, and Douglas Alcott was standing in the bathroom hallway when she stepped out. 66 years old, silver-haired, in a tuxedo that probably cost more than her car, staring directly at her like he'd seen a ghost. "Excuse me," Vera said, stepping around him. "Wrong turn. Wait." His voice was quiet but absolute. The voice of a man who was not accustomed to being ignored, but also, strangely, not cruel about it. "I know you." Vera stopped. "I don't think so." "Vera Langston." He said her full name like it was something he'd kept somewhere careful for a long time. "Pittsburgh. The I-376 overpass. March 5 years ago." She went very still. Douglas Alcott watched her face. "You were the one who stopped." Nobody stopped that night. That was what the officers had told him afterward. It was a 4-car pileup on a rain-slicked stretch of highway, in a storm bad enough that most drivers slowed down just enough to steer around the wreckage and keep moving. It was 11 at night. Visibility was almost nothing. Vera had stopped. She'd been driving back to New York from a job site visit, alone, radio off, windows slightly fogged. She'd seen the smoke before she saw the cars. She'd pulled to the shoulder and gotten out into the rain without thinking about it the way most people think about most things. She'd found a man trapped in the driver's seat of a crumpled Mercedes, conscious but pinned, with a laceration across his shoulder that was bleeding through his shirt faster than it should have been. She'd applied pressure with her own coat. She'd held his hand and talked to him steadily for 22 minutes while they waited for the ambulance, because he'd asked her not to leave, and she didn't leave. She'd ridden with him to Allegheny General because no one else was there, and he'd been frightened in a way that stripped the wealth and status from him, and left just a man who didn't want to be alone. She had never known his name. He'd been sedated before he could give it to her. She'd left her contact card with the nurses and driven back to New York the next morning without hearing from anyone. She'd thought about that night sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. "You're Douglas Alcott," she said. "I've been looking for you for 4 years," he said simply. "I hired someone to find you 18 months ago. They gave me 3 Vera Langstons in the Northeast. None of them were the right one. He paused. What are you doing here tonight? Vera looked at him for a long moment. I was leaving, she said. Douglas Alcott looked back toward the ballroom, and something shifted in his expression. Something that was not warmth, but was close to it. Something that was not anger, but was headed that direction. Don't leave yet, he said. Please. He walked her to a quiet alcove off the main hallway. 2 chairs, a side table with a lamp. The kind of tucked-away corner that old hotels kept for conversations that needed privacy. Vera sat. Douglas remained standing for a moment. And then, with the careful deliberateness of someone doing something that cost him something, he sat too. My son brought you here tonight, he said. It was not a question. He invited me, Vera said. He introduced me as the designer who did his offices. Douglas was quiet. His jaw tightened in a way she'd seen once before in that front seat, when the pain broke through his composure for just a second. I know who you are to my son, he said quietly. I've known about you for 6 months. I've tried to have a conversation with him about it 3 times. His hands rested flat on his knees. He believes our family's position requires a certain kind of woman. He was raised with that belief. I am ashamed to admit I am partially responsible for that. Vera said nothing. What he's done to you tonight? Douglas stopped. I don't have a clean way to say this. He's been seeing Sabrina Wolfe for 8 months. She comes from money. Her family and mine have had a business relationship for 15 years. He looked at her directly. You were never supposed to know. You were meant to quietly disappear after tonight when he ended things. The room was very still. He told you? Vera asked. He told my assistant, who told me an hour ago, thinking I already knew. Douglas paused. I did not know, and I would not have permitted it. Vera folded her hands in her lap. Her face was composed in the way that comes after the body has decided that showing pain is a luxury it can no longer afford. Then why tell me? She asked. Why not just let me disappear? It would have been cleaner. Douglas looked at her with the expression of a man carrying something heavy he had no intention of putting down. Because you sat with me in that car for 22 minutes in the rain, he said. Because you didn't leave when I asked you to stay. Because of that, I am alive. My grandchildren exist, and the least I can do for the woman who gave me that. He stopped. The least I can do is tell you the truth. He stood up. Come back into the ballroom, he said. Walk in beside me, that's all. I'll do the rest. Vera didn't know what Douglas meant by, I'll do the rest. She found out in front of 600 people. They walked back into the ballroom together, the billionaire and the woman in the navy blue dress. And the room registered it immediately, not loudly. Just the way a current shifts. Heads turned, eyes followed. Vera kept her chin level and her pace steady and tried to look like a woman who walked into rooms on the arm of Douglas Alcott every day of her life. Preston saw them from across the room. She watched his face go from confused to pale in the span of 3 seconds. Sabrina saw them next. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes went cold and calculating, in the way Vera had seen 1,000 times and never recognized for what it was. Douglas walked Vera to the center of the room. Not the edges, not the corners, the center where the lighting was warmest and the crowd was thickest. And then he stopped walking. He turned to face her. And then Douglas Alcott, 66 years old, founder of one of the most powerful real estate development companies in the country, worth somewhere north of $3 billion, went down on one knee. The string quartet stopped. Not because anyone told them to, because the musicians saw it, and the bow simply paused. The room went silent. Douglas's voice carried without effort in the stillness. He didn't perform it. He didn't project. He just spoke, the way a man speaks when he means every word. 5 years ago, on a highway outside Pittsburgh, this woman stopped her car in a storm when no one else did. She stayed with me for 22 minutes while I was bleeding, held my hand, kept me conscious, and rode to the hospital to make sure I wasn't alone. He paused. I never knew her name. I found her tonight by accident, and I will not let her leave this room without saying what I should have found a way to say 4 years ago. He looked up at Vera. His eyes were steady but not dry. You saved my life. You owe me nothing. I owe you everything. And I am sorry it took this long. The room was absolutely still. Vera stood with her hands at her sides and her jaw tight, and she did not cry. She would not cry in front of 600 strangers. She would not cry in front of Preston, who was standing 30 feet away, looking like a man watching a building fall on himself. She reached down and took Douglas's hand and helped him to his feet, because that was who she was. The applause started slowly, and then it didn't stop. Preston was very still across the room, and in the space between them, across 600 witnesses and years of silence and one night on a rain-slicked highway, something shifted permanently. Whatever story Preston Alcott had planned for tonight, it was no longer his story to tell. Preston reached her in less than 2 minutes. His face was arranged into something that was trying to be calm and failing at it around the edges. Vera, I need to explain. Which part? She asked. Her voice was level. She was surprised by how level it was. All of it. Let me. He glanced at his father, who was standing 3 feet away. Dad, can you give us a minute? No, Douglas said simply. Preston's composure cracked a fraction. Dad. I said no, Preston. Something crossed Preston's face that Vera had never seen before. Not anger, actual fear. The specific fear of a man realizing the protection he'd always counted on was no longer pointing in his direction. Sabrina appeared at Preston's shoulder. She'd moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd thought about what to do in an emergency. She placed a hand on Preston's arm and looked at Vera with an expression that was attempting sympathy and landing closer to performance. Vera, she said, I know this looks bad. Does it look bad? Vera asked. The question was quiet, not angry, just a question. And somehow the lack of anger was more devastating than rage would have been. Sabrina opened her mouth. How long? Vera asked. Sabrina closed her mouth. 8 months, Vera said, not asking. The number Douglas had given her. 8 months ago was March. You and I had brunch in March, Sabrina. You sat across from me and asked how things were going with Preston and told me you were so happy for me. She paused. Were you with him then? Sabrina looked at Preston. That look, the quick, reflexive turn to him for permission or direction, told Vera everything she would ever need to know about the dynamic between them. The dress was a nice touch, Vera said. I picked it out with you. That must have been efficient. A murmur moved through the guests standing nearby. People were watching, not discreetly anymore. Vera turned to Douglas. Thank you for telling me the truth. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Douglas said. I'm going to get my coat now, Vera said, and I'm going to leave. She turned. She walked, clean and straight, through the center of the room, past the whispers and the stares and the shifted weight of 600 people who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for a long time. She was almost at the door when a man she had never met stepped into her path, not to stop her, but because he dropped something, a black leather card holder, and was picking it up. He glanced up and said sorry, and for a half-second their eyes met, and something in his expression made her stop. "You're Vera Langston," he said. She blinked. "You heard the speech. I was here before the speech." He straightened. Tall, mid-30s, dark jacket that fit like it was built for him, not bought off a rack. A face that was interesting rather than pretty, the kind of face that came from having lived actual things. "I recognized you from a project you did on Orchard Street 2 years ago. The conversion build on the textile warehouse. I walked through it at a client event." Vera studied him. "Colt Mercer," he said. Not like a greeting, like information. She'd heard the name. Real estate development, self-built, no family money, no Alcott Group backing. He'd turned 3 failing commercial districts in Brooklyn into mixed-use projects that architects and urbanists had spent the last 4 years writing about. He was the kind of person her clients mentioned with a specific kind of respect reserved for people who did things the hard way. "I know your work," she said carefully. "I know yours." He picked up the card holder, tucked it into his jacket. The Orchard Street project was the best adaptive reuse work I've seen in New York in a decade. I've been trying to find out who did the interior architecture for 2 years. "You could have Googled it." "I did. But I wanted to meet the person, not the portfolio." He glanced toward the ballroom behind her. "I'm sorry about what happened in there. You handled it better than most people would have." Vera said nothing. "I'm not trying to make this a moment," he said. "You're clearly on your way out, and you don't need a stranger's opinion on anything right now." He held out the card holder, opened. Inside was a single business card, already extended toward her. "I have 3 projects in pre-development that need exactly the kind of thinking you do. If you ever want to talk about actual work, that's my direct number." Vera looked at the card. She looked at him. She took it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He stepped aside. She walked out of the Plaza Hotel into the December snow, card in her hand, chin up, and the night opened around her cold and clear and full of a strange, unfamiliar feeling she hadn't expected. Not broken, not ashamed, free. 3 days later, Vera received a FedEx envelope. No cover letter, just a legal document, 42 pages, and a handwritten post-it note from Douglas Alcott. "You should know what he built his credibility on. I'm sorry it took me this long to look." She sat at her kitchen table in her apartment in Astoria and read every page. Then she read them again. Preston Alcott had launched his personal investment portfolio 4 years ago with what he'd publicly described as a self-funded venture. A narrative he'd leaned into heavily in interviews, positioning himself as the Alcott son who was doing it himself, on his own terms, separate from his father's empire. The document told a different story. The initial capital, $2 million, had come from a silent holding company. Vera was a freelance designer with enough experience in commercial real estate contracts to follow the chain of entities with some effort. She followed it for 2 hours. The money came from a development account that had been drawn down from a project Vera recognized. The Cantor Street renovation in Brooklyn, 2019. The original interior design contract for that project had been awarded to a small firm run by a woman named Jo Pratt. The contract had been abruptly canceled 6 weeks in. The firm cut loose with a 30-day kill fee. The project had then been redesigned in-house, using plans that bore a striking similarity to the originals. Jo Pratt's firm had closed 18 months later. She'd never received attribution. Vera stared at the document. She picked up her phone. She called Jo Pratt. It took her 20 minutes and 3 LinkedIn messages to find her. Jo was now working as a senior designer at a firm in Philadelphia. "You know about the Cantor Street project?" Jo said when Vera explained. "I'm reading about it right now." Silence on the line. Then, "I couldn't prove it. I tried. But I was a firm of 3 people against an Alcott subsidiary, and I didn't have the money to fight it." Her voice was even, the way voices get when the anger has had years to settle into something harder. "I lost 2 years of work and my best 2 junior designers." "I know someone who can look at this," Vera said carefully. "If you're willing." Jo Pratt was quiet for 4 seconds. "Tell me what you need," she said. Vera hung up the phone and sat with the document in front of her, and the December light coming through her kitchen window, and a cold, precise clarity settling in her chest that felt nothing like anger and everything like purpose. She opened her laptop. She pulled up Colt Mercer's card, and she started to type. Colt called back within the hour. She hadn't expected that. She'd sent a 3-sentence email. Professional, low temperature, asking if he had time to meet about a potential project overlap she'd come across that he might find relevant. The kind of email that could be ignored without consequence. He called anyway. "I've been sitting on 2 pieces of a puzzle," he said, without opening pleasantries. "You may have the 3rd. He told her that his company had tried to acquire the Cantor Street building in 2018, before Preston's group obtained it. The bid had been submitted through proper channels. It had been declined without explanation. 3 months later, Colt found out through a real estate attorney that the building had gone to an Alcott-affiliated entity for 5% below his offer. "That's not legal," Vera said. "It's not, but it's also very hard to prove from the outside." Pause. "What do you have?" She described the document Douglas had sent. She didn't send it yet. She wasn't ready to send it yet. "Vera," his voice shifted slightly. "Douglas sent you that?" His post-it was on it. Another pause. She could hear him thinking. "That means Douglas has been building a case, and he used you to start the chain." She hadn't fully understood that until he said it. She held the phone and looked at the 42-page document on her kitchen table. Douglas wasn't a witness to his son's character. He was a father who had looked the other way for too long, who had a debt he couldn't repay, and who had finally decided to stop protecting a man who had stopped deserving protection. "What happens if we put it all together?" she asked. "Preston loses his personal portfolio credibility. The sourcing of that initial capital becomes a liability to the main Alcott Group board. And Jo Pratt has grounds for a civil claim that any attorney in New York would take on contingency." He paused. "It doesn't destroy him, but it's the end of the version of himself he's been selling." Vera nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "There's also a board review in 3 weeks," Colt said. "Preston is being considered for a seat on the Alcott Group's executive committee. The vote is among 4 partners, including Douglas." He paused once more. "If the right information is in front of the right people before that vote, then the vote changes," Vera finished. Yes. She looked at Joe Pratt's number on her phone screen. Then let's make sure it's in front of them, she said. Sabrina called on a Tuesday. Vera almost didn't answer. She sat with the buzzing phone in her hand for 4 rings, watching Sabrina's name on the screen with a detached curiosity of someone examining something they no longer need to be afraid of. She answered on the 5th ring. I just wanted to explain, Sabrina said immediately. Her voice was carefully calibrated, warm, slightly hurt, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed this. I know how it looked. But Preston and I, it was complicated. We never meant for you to find out this way. How did you mean for me to find out? Vera asked. Brief silence. He was going to talk to you. After the gala, he didn't know how. He knew how, Vera said. He just didn't want to. Vera, Sabrina. She kept her voice even. I'm not angry with you. I mean that. What you did was a betrayal, and you know it was. And you'll have to sit with that. But I'm not calling it anything worse than what it is. What I want you to know is this. I'm okay. You don't need to explain yourself to me. You don't need to manage my reaction. Sabrina was quiet. But I need you to not contact me again, Vera said. Not because I hate you, just because this chapter is closed. The line was silent for a moment. Then Sabrina said, and it came out smaller than she'd probably intended. He's going to throw me under the bus too, when everything comes out. You know that, right? Vera did know that. She'd known it from the moment she watched Sabrina look to Preston for permission in the middle of the ballroom. I know, Vera said gently. What should I do? I think you already know, Vera said. I think that's why you're calling me instead of him. Sabrina didn't answer. But 3 days later, Vera received a text from an unknown number. It was a screenshot of a private email thread between Preston and a contact at the zoning office. A string of messages that, read together, described a favor chain that went back 2 years, trading access for accelerated permits on 3 separate Alcott projects. No message attached, just the screenshot. Vera stared at it. Then she forwarded it to Colt with 2 words. She helped. There was one more piece she still didn't have. And on the morning of the board review, it arrived on her doorstep in a sealed envelope from a return address she didn't recognize. The envelope contained a USB drive and a handwritten note. The handwriting was Douglas's. This recording was made during a private strategy meeting 13 months ago. I have kept it because I could not decide what to do with it. I have decided. DA. Vera plugged the drive into her laptop. The recording was 51 minutes of a meeting between Preston, the Alcott Group's chief legal officer, and 2 external consultants. She listened to the whole thing at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. By the time it finished, her hands were steady and her face was still, and she understood what Douglas had done. He had spent years watching his son operate, watching him cut corners, source capital dishonestly, use the family name as a weapon and as a shield simultaneously. He had tried, privately, repeatedly, to redirect him. It hadn't worked. And then a woman in a navy blue dress had appeared at his family's gala. A woman his son had been hiding for 2 years. A woman Douglas had been searching for 4 years. And Douglas Alcott had understood that the time for private conversations was over. He had put everything into her hands, not because he wanted to destroy Preston, but because he believed that people who behaved without consequence became something worse than they started. He believed his son still had the capacity to become something better. But that could only happen after the version of himself Preston had been protecting came apart. Vera closed her laptop. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she called Colt. "I have the last piece." "The board review is at 10 tomorrow morning," he said. "I know." She paused. "I'm going." A beat. "Do you want me there?" She thought about it. Thought about walking into that conference room alone versus walking in with someone beside her who had already proven he showed up. "Yes," she said. "I do." The Alcott Group's executive offices were on the 38th floor of a tower on Park Avenue, all clean lines and northern light. Vera had been in buildings like this 100 times as a designer. She had always entered through the service entrance. She entered through the front door. Colt was beside her. He was not performing anything. He was simply there, calm and solid, in a dark gray jacket. With a leather folder under his arm that held 3 sets of printed documents, the financial sourcing chain, Joe Pratt's original contract compared against the final plans, and a summary prepared by a real estate attorney who had agreed, after 20 minutes reviewing the evidence, to put her name on it. The recording was on a drive in Vera's jacket pocket. Douglas met them in the lobby. He looked, Vera thought, like a man who had slept badly and woken up resolved. "My son doesn't know you're coming," Douglas said. "I know," Vera said. "Are you ready for what happens after?" She looked at him. "Are you?" Something moved across Douglas Alcott's face that she couldn't fully name. Not grief, exactly. More like the specific pain of a person doing a necessary thing that they had waited too long to do. "Let's go," he said. The boardroom held 4 people when they entered. The 3 other executive partners and Preston, who looked up when the door opened and went completely still when he saw Vera. His expression went through 5 things in 2 seconds. She watched all of them. The legal officer started to say this meeting is private. Douglas spoke over him without raising his voice. "She's here at my request." Preston stood. "Dad, what is this?" "Sit down, Preston. Whatever she's told you, sit down." Preston sat. Colt set the documents on the table. Vera plugged the drive into the conference room laptop. She did not explain herself. She did not perform. She simply presented, clearly, precisely, in the way she'd learned to present to clients who needed information and not theater. The full picture of what Preston Alcott had built his reputation on. The recording played for 12 minutes. When it finished, the boardroom was quiet in the way of rooms where something irreversible has just occurred. One of the executive partners, a woman named Sylvia Brandt, who had been with the company for 20 years, looked at Preston for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Douglas. "The vote is postponed," she said. "Indefinitely. And we'll need outside counsel in here by end of week." Preston looked at his father. His voice came out low and broken. "You did this. You did this," Douglas said. Not with cruelty, with the flatness of a man stating a fact. "I just stopped covering it up." The story moved fast after that. By the end of the week, Preston's personal investment fund was under review. The Cantor Street sourcing story had reached 2 real estate journalists. Not through Vera, not through Colt, but through Joe Pratt, who had kept her own documentation for 3 years and was ready when someone finally gave her a channel. Joe didn't frame it as a revenge story. She told it plainly, the way people with legitimate grievances tell things when they finally have space to speak. What happened to my firm, what it cost me, what the paper trail shows. The story ran in a business publication on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Preston's interview requests had dried up. The conference speaking slot he'd been announced for in February was quietly reassigned. The Hamptons property he'd been marketing under his own name was listed under the Alcott Group umbrella instead. Sabrina did not come out of it cleanly either. The permit exchange screenshots she had sent Vera were eventually subpoenaed as part of the outside counsel review. Her involvement in a separate land use consultation that had benefited from the same favor chain became a matter of public record. She resigned from her position at her family's development firm in January, citing personal reasons. Nobody called it what it was out loud. But everybody knew. Preston was not criminally charged. The evidence wasn't clean enough for that. And Douglas had not wanted that outcome. What Preston received instead was a slower, more lasting consequence. The removal of his path forward within the company his family had built, the collapse of the independent credibility he'd spent years constructing, and the complete evaporation of the particular version of himself he'd shown the world. He called Vera once, in February. She did not answer. She did not block the number either, because blocking it would have suggested she still thought about him. She didn't. Not with anger, not with longing. Just occasionally. The way you sometimes think about something that used to hurt and realize, with a mild surprise, that it no longer does. The first project she did with Colt's company broke ground in March. A mixed-use development on the waterfront in Red Hook, commercial ground floor, residential above, with a community space in the center that Vera had designed to feel, she said in her notes, like a living room that belongs to everyone. High ceilings, honest materials, natural light from 3 directions, and a layout that made a person feel welcome the moment they stepped inside without being able to say exactly why. That was what she was best at, creating the feeling of being seen. Colt read her design notes every time she submitted them, which was not something all developers did. He gave her feedback that was substantive and specific. He disagreed with her twice, once about the material cost trade-off on the ground floor facade, once about the flow of the community entrance. And both times they had actual conversations, long ones, during which she changed his mind on one thing and he changed hers on the other. She thought, after the second conversation, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. Not the careful management of someone's comfort. Not the suppression of your own judgment so someone else's could sit unchallenged. An actual exchange between 2 people who took each other seriously. She told him about the gala, about Preston and Sabrina, not as a confessional, but as context. One afternoon when they were reviewing drawings over lunch at a diner in Brooklyn. She told it straightforwardly and without performance. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long were you with him?" 2 years. Did he ever make you feel like this? He gestured simply at the drawings between them. She understood what he meant. Not the project, the exchange, the room where both people counted. "No," she said. "Then he never knew who you were," Colt said. Not cruelly, just as fact. Which was his loss and, it turns out, his damage, not yours. She looked at the Red Hook drawings. "I know," she said. And for the first time in a long time, she meant it all the way down. Douglas Alcott called in April, not about business. They met for coffee at a place in the West Village that was small and not famous, and that he had chosen specifically, she understood, to avoid the kind of rooms where his presence became a performance. He asked about the Red Hook project. She told him about it. He listened like a man who was genuinely curious and not simply waiting to speak, which was, she had learned, an unusual quality in people who had accumulated the kind of power he had. "Preston is in therapy," he said after a while, unprompted. "He started in February. His own choice." A pause. "I don't know what that will amount to, but I thought you might want to know." "Thank you," she said. "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not asking you to feel anything about it. I just—" He paused again, and for a moment he looked exactly as he had looked in that car on the highway, stripped of everything but the essential person underneath. "I wanted you to know that I didn't stop. That what you made possible that night in the gala. I didn't walk away from it." Vera looked at him across the small table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When you knelt down in the ballroom, was that for me? Or was it something you needed to do?" Douglas considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Both," he said finally. "I won't lie to you and say it was only for you. I've been carrying that night for 5 years. What you did was a gift I never got to acknowledge. And the weight of that, it was time." He looked at her steadily. "But I also knew what my son had done to you in that room. And I wanted every person in it to understand, whatever else happened that night, who you were." Vera was quiet for a moment. "It worked," she said. Douglas smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that costs something. "Good," he said. The Red Hook project opened in October. The community space drew a write-up in a design publication that described the interior architecture as quietly extraordinary. Vera read the piece on her phone at her kitchen table and set it down and sat with it for a minute. She had, in the years since the gala, taken on 4 more projects of her own. 2 residential builds referred by Colt's network, 1 commercial renovation in Cobble Hill, 1 adaptive reuse project in the Bronx that was her favorite thing she'd ever worked on. She had hired a junior designer in September, a 24-year-old from the Bronx named Delia, who reminded Vera of herself in ways that made her want to do the job better. She was not rich, but she was building something real. Colt took her to a restaurant in November. A good one, candlelit, the kind where the menu didn't have prices on the copy they handed to one guest. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. Over the second glass of wine, he said, "I've been thinking about something for a while." "Okay," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. "The saying it part. I'm better at the showing it part, but I've been told that the saying part matters too." She waited. "I think you're the most remarkable person I've met in a long time," he said. Not rushed, not performing, just honest in the way he was always honest, straight and quiet. "And I'd like to know if you'd want to build something together, beyond the work." Vera looked at him across the candles. She thought about the ballroom, the bathroom stall, the highway in the rain 5 years ago, and a man she hadn't known who'd asked her not to leave, and she hadn't left because that was just who she was. Someone who stayed when it mattered. She thought about what it felt like to be in a room where someone knew who you were and wanted you to be more of it. "Yes," she said, "I would." They got engaged on a Wednesday. Not a planned Wednesday. Not a Wednesday, with a reservation and a ring hidden in a dessert. An ordinary Wednesday in March. When they were walking back from a site visit in Red Hook in the late afternoon, the East River's silver gray beside them, and the Brooklyn skyline doing what it always did in that light, which was look like something that mattered. Colt stopped walking. She stopped too. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and pulled out a ring. Not a dramatic ring, not a ring designed to be photographed or talked about. A ring with a pale green tourmaline, not a diamond she'd mentioned once, half a year ago, that she found diamonds impersonal. Set in a simple gold band, elegant in the way of things that are made with care and not with noise. "I've been carrying this since November," he said. "I kept waiting for the right time, and then I realized there isn't a right time. There's just the time when you're ready. And I've been ready." Vera looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought briefly about a version of herself that had stood in a navy blue dress at the edge of a ballroom, trying to make herself small enough that no one would notice her, waiting for a man who was ashamed of her. That version of herself felt very far away. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. They stood on the waterfront in the March cold, and he held her hand, and the river moved, and the city went on around them the way cities go on, indifferent and magnificent and alive. And Vera Langston felt, in the simple and unhurried way of things that are finally true, that she had arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. There is a kind of woman who learns, early and thoroughly, to take up less space. She learns it from rooms that go quiet when she enters them. From the small corrections, the downward glances, the redirected conversations, the hand at the back that steers instead of steadies. From the men who love her privately and manage her publicly and call it protection while it is happening. Vera Langston was that woman. And here is what no one tells you about that kind of woman. She is not waiting to be rescued. She does not need someone to arrive and declare her value to a room. She knows her own value. She has always known it. What she needs, what any person needs, is simply to stop explaining herself to people who have already decided not to see her. The night at the plaza, Douglas Alcott knelt in front of 600 people, not because Vera needed permission to be real, but because he was a man who had received an extraordinary grace and refused to let it go unacknowledged. What he gave her that night was not her worth. Her worth was already hers. What he gave her was witness, and sometimes witness is enough to change the direction of a life. Preston Alcott did not become a better man that night. That is a longer story, and it belongs to him. But he lost the comfortable lie he had been living inside, and losing a comfortable lie, even a painful one, is the first condition of becoming something more honest. Sabrina Wolf had to look at herself clearly for the first time in years. That is its own kind of consequence. And Vera built something real, with her hands and her mind and her eye for the way a room should feel when it wants a person to stay. She hired a young woman who reminded her of herself. She walked into rooms through the front door. She said yes to a man who asked her in an ordinary moment, on an ordinary Wednesday, because he was ready. And so was she. She never went back to making herself small. She never had a reason to again. If this story found you tonight, if any part of it was yours, know that the thing you've been waiting for permission to do is already yours to do. You don't need a ballroom. You don't need a crowd. You just need to stop explaining yourself to the wrong people and start building for the right ones. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. So, the story is finally closed. And hey, if you're still here with us right now, at this very moment, I just want to say something real to you. If you stayed this long, something touched you. Maybe it was the way Vera stood alone in that ballroom in her navy dress, waiting for a man who was never going to choose her out loud. Maybe it was the moment a father got down on one knee not to propose, but to say thank you to a woman his son was ashamed of. Or maybe it was just a Wednesday, a ring, and two people who finally got it right. Here's what this story leaves with me, and I hope it leaves it with you too. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Vera didn't wait for Preston to validate her. She didn't fight for a seat at a table that never wanted her. She walked out and built her own. The Stoics had a phrase, amor fati, love your fate, even the painful part. Because the painful part is exactly what teaches you who you are when no one is watching. You're not too much. You're not hard to love. You have just been in the wrong room. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so we can keep walking through stories like this together. We'll see you next time. A quick and important note before you go. This story is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment, emotional reflection, and storytelling purposes. All characters, including Vera Langston, Preston Alcott, Douglas Alcott, Colt Mercer, and Sabrina Wolfe, are completely fictional and do not represent any real individuals, living or deceased. All events, locations, companies, and situations depicted in this video are products of creative imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, places, or real-life events is purely coincidental and entirely unintentional. This content is not intended to present factual claims, legal accusations, or real-world allegations of any kind. The themes explored, including betrayal, personal growth, and emotional healing, are dramatized scenarios designed to inspire reflection and meaningful conversation. This channel is committed to original, responsible storytelling. Thank you for watching with an open heart and for understanding the creative and fictional nature of everything you've seen here today.